Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Again, I'm out here. I got a fire crackling in the background behind the doors there. I had to close the doors last time. Let a little bit Got a little too smoky in here after the video, so I just shut her down. But anyway, I hope you're having a fantastic day. Um, you know, as it's cooling down, as you can tell, we got the fire, the whole thing, right? As we ebb ever so closer to official winter. But today, I want to get some of these topics serious. It's serious, but it's not, we got to have fun with it too, right? I mean, what's the point? If we can't have fun, then we're doing something wrong. Right. That doesn't mean we can't be serious, but we gotta have fun. We gotta make fun of ourselves, but not take ourselves too serious, right? I mean, look, I'm out in a shop, for goodness sakes. I mean, how much less serious do you want me to take myself? But we gotta have a little levity in our communications, right? We can sometimes be a little too sterile. But anyway, so wanted to touch on this one before we got a little any closer to the holiday time frame. And today is breaking generational curses. I know that's not a shallow into the pool kind of a subject, is it? But that being said, breaking generational curses, often when we hear that, if you've ever heard that, it may be for some of you, maybe never heard that term before. But breaking generational curses can have the initial flash of, well, it's about my family. Well, it is true that it can be about family. So much of our lives extends beyond our family, right? I mean, as often happens on this channel, because we delve into the organizational culture and then we find where there's relevance and benefit that ripples outward into the rest of culture and in our own lives. And that includes families and personal relationships and everything else, right? Civic relationships, our churches, community and all facets, right? So we want to make sure that, hopefully as time rolls forward, whatever you learn, see the greater symbolism and how it applies to all of your life, not just to your working life, not just to your home life, right? How can it apply to all your entire life? But on that note, talking about breaking generational curses. Now, the second part of that, the curses part, right, can harken back to ancient times, and it can feel like, ooh, somebody put a curse on us or that kind of thing. It can sound pretty woo-woo, type thing. And it's really not. If we're to extract out the ones and zeros of the situation when we're talking about generational curses, it is literally breaking the conditioning of our past, right? That can be family, that can be community, that can be work, it can be all of it, right? And in organizations may have been around, particular organizations, not all, of course, for many generations or many decades for sure, right? So it may not be full generations, but there definitely is cycles. Now, if you've heard of 20-year cycles where it seems like history and in a way repeats itself every 20 years, you can step back from that and say, well, is it repeating itself? If that is the case, why is that? Is it that the generation coming up behind and the one after that, the lessons of the past have not been communicated to the next generation, right? So therefore, there's a repetition, a repeating of past mistakes, right? I can't remember who made the quote, but essentially, to paraphrase, you're destined to repeat the past if you don't learn from the past. I mean, I was totally botched that up, but you get the idea, right? And with our conditioning of our own lives, I mean, you can go back to your life 10, 20, 30, and then, and more for many of us, and further. And you can see how you've transitioned and transformed, and you started out in one particular, life goal, and maybe went to school, or maybe you found a new interest or hobby, all the things, right? And your life takes on a bit of a treasure map feel, right? Where you go to point A, and then you go to point B and C, and then you were getting ready to go to D, but then you got, you had to cross this alligator pond, and because of that, you had to go over here instead, and each life has its own unique adventure, right? The generational curses essentially is that conditioning, the conditioning that we carry forward, right? And this is where systems, talking about systems, look, the difference between having a system and having no system is order and chaos, okay? Or order and chaos if you prefer, whatever, right? One or the other. If you have a system, there is more order. If you don't have a system, there is chaos. Now, does that mean when you have a system that there isn't some inherent chaos? No, there can be. And part of that is because if the system is not set up or built to grow with the individual, or with the family, with the culture, with the business, whatever. If it isn't robust enough, if there isn't enough flexibility within that system to allow for change. An example would be you have O plans, operations plans within an organization. Well, what if you take on and something changes? You add a new building, or you start using new equipment. Well, you update your O plan because maybe there are different safety considerations. There are different hours and processes that you might follow for opening and closing up the building. And I mean, we can go on and on about all that, right? But the point is there has to be flexibility to be able to grow with the organization. In the same way, you could use going to the gym. If you'd never worked out and you start going to the gym, you're going to follow a plan. Hopefully you're following a plan. Highly recommend you do that for your safety and health. But you're going to follow a plan that is best for introducing you to working out, right? In whatever form that takes, right? For you. It is tailored for you for the most part, right? To get you started. But as you go, 5, 6, it might even be a year or two later, 5 years later, 10, whatever. You look back and you're going to be a completely different person as it relates to fitness if you've kept up, right? Looking back at how you got started. If you're an athlete, as you developed, if you were an athlete, same thing. And this holds true for anything you do. It wouldn't matter if you were helping your dad work on cars, or if you were doing carpentry or whatever it is, right? Or maybe a design, right? When you started out, we'll say many moons ago, however many moons that might be is up to you, your own life and your own journey. But however many moons that was, you now versus you then, completely different paradigm. Now, we don't think about that when we think about breaking generational curses. But imagine if you had never changed your process and your approach, and you'd never evolved past, we'll say the first time working out. If you had never, that first year, if you'd never grew past that, and you never learned different machines, or got better at cardio or other things, right? You could be going to the gym, and you could potentially be doing, it may be doing you no good whatsoever, right? And that's essentially the idea of breaking generational curses. Caught in conditioning that of the old, what worked for the past generation or 2 generations ago, and so on and so forth, right? And then being able to evolve forward right? And the idea here isn't to throw away generational or wisdom. That's not the point of this. But it is to say when we're breaking generational curses, the emphasis and the focus should be on the word curses, generational mistakes, generational pitfalls, generational errors, generational misgivings, generational, think of any of the negative words you can. Generational, okay? Breaking that cycle means we're going to stop doing these negative things and we're going to shift, right? That is what a shift is. It is shifting from the generational curses of the past, right? Now, that past could be yesterday in your own life, yesterday versus today, right? You should be in an ever evolving breaking of generational curses. I'll give you an example. My mom, God love her, she's passed now, but she was always very not pessimistic. I'm sure there's another word for it, but she would definitely more of a glass is half empty earlier in life. Later in life, definitely way more optimistic. Probably as I grew up and got out of the house, and and then I had my kids, which would be her grandkids. And obviously we we evolved forward. She broke that curse, right? But she had that. There's kind of a little pessimism in her tone and her manner, right? And in her thought process and her thinking, and you can see, and I could see just a thread of it in my grandmother. By and large, was almost never seen. But if I ever, I had to actually remember back to go, did I ever see that? Yes, I did. But you can see, Mom carried that curse, right? To think of the worst. Now, I will say, early part of my life, I've had moments too, and I'm fully aware of it, when that generational thought process is to go, oh my gosh, think the worst, right? The worst outcome, the worst scenario, right? Now, we have to be careful here, right? Because there's a difference between just automatically assuming the worst, right? Or being open to possibilities, whatever they may be. And that's where finding the middle path is important. When you break the generational curse, it is to recognize, hey, I don't want to get caught in basically making myself biased to be negative. In this example, this is what it applies to, right? I don't want to bias myself negatively. Now, I will say, and I even put it in the book, so I owned it. Okay, I owned it. Driving, people cutting you off, all that kind of stuff. That was my last real challenge, because to be like, how could these people drive like this? This is just not sane, right? And it's dangerous, right? It was essentially people being dangerous. And I was right to feel the way I felt, but I also had to understand that there's more going on. And there's always more going on under the layers, right? And that isn't to justify any bad behavior. That is never the point. But it is to say that how we process, right? How we process can actually make things worse. And as we do that, we carry that generational curse forward. If, let's say, my kids heard me, get irritated at people driving. And I've seen this in families too, where it's really bad, where the parents were like that, they were not too, happy drivers, and the kids grew up to be just, road ragers, right? So it's real obvious to see, and once you've seen this, you can't unsee it. Now, I've used the driving thing, and I've, and those sorts of things, and the attitude example, right, about being negative, about assuming that the worst, right? But it can go into every facet of our life. It can erode personal relationships, family, extended family. It can erode friend relationships. It can erode, relationships within the community. The community at large can take on the persona of being pessimistic or negative. And then, of course, there's the political seasons. There's the different religious factions. There's all the things, right? And organizations out there, and competing organizations, and people in organizations who are competing with one another. And you see where this breaking generational curses is really us saying, how do we break the paradigm of our assumptions and our biases, right? How do we overcome that and don't let it take us over, and don't become, the glove that say a bad attitude, being the hand in this situation. We don't just become a glove along for the ride, not in control of our attitude or our behavior. Because why? Well, my parents were this way, I'm this way, my kids are going to be this way, my grandkids are going to be this way. Now, that's fantastic in a loving, kind, hopeful, helpful, collaborative, innovative, harmonizing kind of world. And obviously, we know we live in an imperfect world, so I'm not saying it is that way. But I am here to tell you that if we perpetuate the negative, we're just going to see more negative, right? I mean, it seems pretty obvious, right? If you perpetuate the negative, if you become the poster child for the negative, then what? Then you're going to see a perpetuated negative, and you're going to see people latch on to that. Sometimes I'll use a negative attitude as an example because it's an easy one. It's low-hanging fruit in this situation, but the negative attitude about things becomes a way for folks to exercise their anguish and their anger, right? So the generational curse, the symptom, you might be saying the symptom might be, frustration and all that, or the negative attitude, but underlying, it's the anger and frustration. Why? Well, there isn't enough communication. Somebody I'm not being understood, or I'm not being heard, not being understood. Somebody's not taking me seriously, all the things, right? And that isn't spoken, but the frustration or the negative, the negativity comes out. And you see this when folks say, well, this company doesn't care about anybody. Kind of a broad generalization. When you start to get into generalizations, right, this is how you know that there is an underlying anger or frustration. Someone is trying to either blame or make somebody else responsible for their frustration about something, right? Instead of opening up communication to resolve conflict, right, and resolve misunderstandings, right, and to break generational curses or conditioning, right? To break that means we have to do something different, right? Was it Einstein that said, I think it was Einstein, said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? If that's the going definition, then there we go. We have to break the chain. We have to break in the safety world. When I was doing that in the Air Force primarily, you have to break the chain. You have to say, okay, I'm not going to react in this way, right? Now, deep in a far corner of some family that I have that will never watch this video, they'll never even be on YouTube probably. Probably don't even know how to work a computer. But far off in the corner of some family, distant family that I don't associate with, there are folks who are, racist. Let's just call it what it is. And I don't condone any of that. I grew up being an accepting kid. People are people, and it's about who you are. Character counts. Character, and my grandfather was a Marine, and he was very much about character. Both of them, all my grandparents were, but that isn't to say that there aren't folks out there. But I use that as an example, breaking generational curses, right? So there are folks out there who use racism, for example. There are people who are racist. There's some people who are racist and they don't really understand why. Well, track back. It was some conditioning. It was something you heard. It was something that somebody heard and said, something that was accepted. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was just offhanded, but you didn't even know. You were maybe too young to even realize what was. But because of who said whatever they was said, it was just accepted as a normative behavior, and then it just became easy to fall into that. And that's a good example of a generational curse, right? So what then? Now, how do we break that generational curse? Well, usually you have a revelation in the sense of you're working with somebody, you're playing on a team, or you're this, whatever, where you're exposed to other people of other ethnic backgrounds, other races, right? And then you go, oh, all right, and then you get to know them and you learn about them, and what you end up figuring out, folks, is people are people, right? People at the core, people are people. And it really is the instrument of the matrix, right, that wants to keep you at odds. Now, this is where we go back. This is where systems can work against us. Some systems then can be perpetuators of that generational curse. If a system is such that it perpetuates negative behavior and negative outcomes, right, for yourself or others, that's how you can test, folks. This isn't rocket science. How do we know the negative is it's leaving a negative impression on you, on others, or the outcome is negative, right? If it's divisive, if it's dividing people, right? And so you have to break that generational curse. But on the flip side, it becomes real easy for someone to say, oh, because if we've lived too long with putting people in the box as a racist this or a feminist that or da 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 or toxic masculinity or da da da, all the things, right? We're just creating boxes and throwing people in those. Well, you're going to have to break those curses, folks. And because at its core, people are people. People have the same fundamental needs that, I have the same fundamental needs as you, and you as others, and others as others, and so on and so forth. At its base level, we're essentially all the same, folks. And when we realize that, when we cut away the clutter and go, well, who wins by us not getting along? Who wins by us being at odds with one another? Who wins? When you start to step back and you ask, well, who wins? It's not you or the other folks that you may think you're at odds with, right? But as long as you've bought into it, you haven't broken the generational curse. So you have to what? Change your behavior. Do something different, right? Just like we said before. Expecting a different outcome by doing the same thing over and over again. Open up your mind and start to receive people as people and start to be, and this is why I put in the book, we're here to protect love, folks, right? That's a great starting point, a great anchor point, if you will, to be able to start the process of breaking generational curses. And what you'll find is that when you have that as your starting point, well, me being reactive and saying a harsh thing, and we're all human. We're going to make mistakes. This is not going to be a flip a switch on Monday and you all of a sudden are, just, skating, gleefully on Tuesday. No, it's going to take practice, right? You think it took me practice to not to get all wound up whenever somebody cut me off in traffic? Absolutely. I had to recognize what was happening and then recognize real time. Oh my gosh, this pressed my buttons. I can't let this press my buttons. It's not a dire emergency, right? Well, could have been, right? but in most cases it wasn't. So this is why we have to stop, folks, and we have to kind of hit the reset button, slow it down, and catch ourselves real time. Don't, we want to respond, don't react, right? And we want to understand. And if you actually seek to understand others, you're going to find that the more you understand others, the more they're going to understand you. And even if they don't understand you, you understanding them is half the battle, right? and now you understand what's going on, and the process begins. Next thing you know, you're getting along, you've made new friends, you've opened up a whole new world that you never even knew was possible or was out there waiting for you to connect with. And that can be an amazing thing. So breaking generational curses is getting people out of their boxes, right? Opening people up. Because if I'm doing something to put you in a box that you can never get out of, right? If I say, oh, you're a racist, and boom, and I just label you, and now forever and ever in my mind, you will always be that, well, that gives you no room to grow, right? So we have to be careful that we're not judging others, because that too is also a generational curse. On that note, folks are happy. Hope you're having a great day. Remember to hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. When we do this, not only are we helping to transform culture for the better, but we're transforming our own lives. Remember, we can't transform anything on the outside unless we're willing to transform on the inside. All right, folks, hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.